Episode 57, Faith in the Fresh Five podcast. I'm your host, Rohadi, coming at you from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode. Patty Krawec, she is the author of Becoming Kin. Pick up that book. We are 2 Canadians on the northern part of Turtle Island. And in this episode, we discuss decolonizing the church. What does that look like? What are the possibilities? I hope you enjoy it. Hey, don't forget to rate and review this podcast. That helps. And also share it. If you are a podcast person, share it with all your podcast friends. Bring it to Podcast Club. That's the thing, right? Let's jump into this episode. Rohadi and Patty. Becoming Kin, an Indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future. Both our books are very similar. In my chapter 5 and 6 does a very quick history. I kind of square into the Western Church and its malformed roots, the power structures, malformed power, rooted in white supremacy and all that it avails. And I feel like 2/3, where I spend 2 chapters, you weave story through a good 2/3 of your book, if not a little bit more, and then specifically around Indigenous and then a little bit around Black folks as well. And the call to, there's a bit of an education here, not a bit. There is a depth of understanding that you invite readers to journey with, and journey's the apt word because you weave the history through storytelling. And so for that reason, folks should pick it up, especially folks in Canada, but we also want all the American folks because there's 10 times more to pick it up and tell all their friends and so forth like that. But I want to spend the rest of our time around where we kind of trailed off, because we both trailed off as well. We trailed off in the sunset around the end. And so the last third for me, part 3 or 4, I'm not sure if I had 4 parts. And then for you, it was the final 3 chapters around what the dream, and this is, I don't think either of us use this language. You might, but correct me if I'm wrong. The dream of what the liberated community can potentially look like. Yeah.
So there's a neat phrase, we make the road by walking. Spanish poet Antonio Machado said that. Miriam Kaba talks about that as well. You know, we build the future. We create the future by building it together. So, and we take several runs at it. Maybe we don't, we try this and maybe that didn't work. And so we try that and maybe that didn't work. Maybe that doesn't work, but we keep trying. And in the process of trying, we do wind up building something better. That last chapter was really tough for me to write. Like you said, about 2/3 of the book is history, because my editor kept reminding me that you can't assume a base level of knowledge. And a lot of the feedback that I'm getting from people is that they didn't know. And honestly, that baffles me, how they didn't know. But what I wanted to do was to show how all of these different things are connected, not just to each other, but to us as individuals, as communities, that these things are connected. Like people can do not only their own family tree, they can do a professional family tree, a tree of their profession, and line it up with history and look at what was going on historically. Like I was a social worker for many years, and that's got deep roots in whiteness and all kinds of things. So that last chapter was really tough, partly because by the time I got there, I wasn't sure I wanted to be in solidarity with them anymore. I had just been immersed in how wrong whiteness keeps getting everything. Yeah. I was like, I don't know if I want to be in solidarity with you anymore. So I start with the story about the deer because I use a lot of Ojibwe stories, as a way of kind of shifting people's frame of reference. And, so I start with the story of the Anishinaabe and the deer. And so, in a nutshell, we had been behaving very badly. And the deer basically left. They abandoned us. They were like, you know what? I know we promised to take care of you, but if you kill us all, then we're not going to be here to take care of you anyway. And so they, kind of, took off into the woods. And, so the Anishinaabe had a very hungry winter, because we didn't have enough deer. So we had a very hungry winter, and winter is storytelling time. So, and I think when you're hungry, you hear some of these stories a little differently. And then in the spring, they sent out runners. They found the deer explained, and so they were able to put things back together. And then my friend Alexis Shotwell points out that as we're talking about putting things back together, so I think it's okay for us to retreat into our own space, into our own like Indigenous only or Black only or Black and Indigenous only. I think it's okay for us to retreat into our own spaces. That's part of coming back to ourselves. Mm-hmm. I think it's okay for white Christians, for white people. I think they need to, have a time out and have a good hard think about what they've done and their theology, how their theology played into it. People want to rush past those first 5 chapters, 5 or 6, 5 chapters and get to the hope part. I think they really need to sit with it and look at where their theology connects with these songs that they're still singing. Like there's this really beautiful song about how there's no outsiders to your love. And, I was shipwrecked on the shore and blah, blah, blah. There's no outsiders. It's a beautiful song. But we're right by the Niagara Falls border and we're busy keeping people out, right? Canada's got that safe third country agreement that effectively prevents refugees and migrants from Central and South America from getting here because they've been to the U.S. first. Safe third country. The U.S. is not safe, but they can't come here. And so then they cross, and so then they cross in unsafe ways. And a lot of them have died trying to cross those borders, trying to cross not at the border, like not at official border entries, but kind of through woods and fields. So we sing these songs on one hand and yet promote these terrible policies on the other. So I think it's okay for white Christians to have a time out, to have a good hard think about what they've done. That's what the Anishinaabe in the story had to do. We had a good long time out thinking and returning to ourselves, figuring out who we were and who we wanted to be, so that when we come back together and we start forming relationships of solidarity, what my friend Alexis pointed out is this was no longer a consumptive relationship. So the Anishinaabe, we did go back. We still hunt deer and eat deer. But when whiteness, the metaphor only works so far, right? So when whiteness and Indigenous and Black, when we come back together, it can no longer be a consumptive relationship. That's what it has been. It has been a consumptive relationship where they take our land, they take your labor, they take all of these things, and we can't rebuild a consumptive relationship again. We have to come back as peers, as Black and Indigenous people who are capable of creating our own knowledge in our own ways, in our own languages. That's valuable knowledge. It's not like, oh wow, look at the Native people do that. Cool. Yeah, we've always known that. And our way of knowing is valuable. And so, but I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I don't know what that would look like in the academy. I don't know what that would look like in the church. I don't know if the church can decolonize. I think if it's holding its central mission or its central reason for existing as missionizing, if that's its central reason for existing, then I don't think it can decolonize. Then I think it's inherently colonial. And maybe it just needs to wrestle with that.
To linger around is what you have already raised, whether churches, and let's pick that institution since it's pertinent to us, whether churches or institutions, church institutions can change. And I wouldn't think that perhaps in its DNA, but that there are many institutions that currently function through a lens of mission. A lot of them have that as part of it, but that doesn't describe their primary function anymore. I'm thinking out loud here. Its primary function would be to the insiders, and generally, not all, generally to preserve a particular way of life. And a particular white way of life.
But there is some expansionist tendency, right? Like there's, people, busy planting churches and funding missionaries, funding missions and, building schools in poor countries without thinking about why, kind of what system they're setting up. They go out and they teach literacy because poor Central American people don't have systems of reading or writing. Like what are we exporting here? When we have to go there to teach literacy, literacy to what end? How are we defining that? So particular way of life, still missionizing, but maybe in a different way.
My sense is the effort and the energy and the money in particular is how to keep things the same from within. It's not really an expansion thing. It's a preservation because of, they're dwindling or at best holding the same, but they're dwindling.
Yeah.
And that's a different posture where in that current state, when you draw in aspects that poke the status quo of whiteness, and we'll just call institutional whiteness or institutional Christianity is connected or embedded, it's the same with whiteness, that to adopt postures which I think are historical to the church, such as justice, you're actually pressing against one of the cherished icons of church function today, which is the preservation of whiteness.
Yeah,
maybe that's too far.
No, you said something, and I'm going to kind of flip around into your book because you said something in there. Was talking about Rome and about kind of the church aligning with Rome, and I made a note in the margins that the church shifted its collective mentality for an individual mentality, because as it existed collectively, it existed in opposition to the state.
Yes, yeah.
And when it became part of the state, it could no longer exist in opposition to the state. It had to, so now it's all about my personal relationship with Jesus. It's no longer about this kind of collective identity that builds liberation from it's about coming in with the answers. To these devastated communities. Sarah Augustine asked this beautiful question. They never asked us if we had good news for them.
Yeah. Ooh.
And so like the institutional church, and maybe it's if as it exists as an institution, it can't decolonize, because I don't think institutions are capable of decolonizing.
Yeah, that's not what they're designed for.
They're not designed. They're designed for exactly what you said, is self-preservation. And Chrissy Stroop said the most amazing thing on Twitter about conservatism being abusive, leading to abuse because it's inevitably abusive, because institutions will protect themselves at the expense of the people who inhabit them. And we see that happening over and over and over again. Church communities, child welfares, governments, we're watching it. We're watching the royal family implode, because over and over again, these institutions protect themselves at the expense of the people who inhabit them. And the people who inhabit them are just supposed to put up with it, are just supposed to stay quiet and accept it, because somehow the institution is greater than they are. And that's nonsense.
Well, you assimilate for that, either the drive to preserve a particular way of life, or for that sense of power. But if you don't do those things, you're going to get hurt. And a lot of folks are getting hurt.
So a lot of Native traditions have like a sacred clown society or some kind of contrary or trickster figure.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole role of that trickster figure, or if you're a contrary or a member of the clown society, is not to be silly or ridiculous the way we think of clowns, but to provoke change, right? Like if the protocol is that you enter the sweat lodge this way, the sacred clown will enter it wrong. Is to prevent these things from ossifying and becoming more important than the people, right? Their traditions need to serve the people. And a friend of mine, because I haven't completely lost hope in the church, I know there's a lot of good abolition work coming out of some churches. And so the friend of mine, Jonathan, and I have to follow up with him on that. He made a reference that the church used to have a similar tradition of clowns in the church whose role was to upend tradition and to prevent this kind of institutionalization of belief. And that's really interesting to me, because I think if the church could let go of the institution and start listening for what good news, because if God is if the kingdom of God is among us, if the kingdom of God is here, then shouldn't they be looking for it instead of trying to impose it? Shouldn't they be wondering, what has God been doing here for, like, wow, like you have been without that, you have existed for thousands of years in this place. What has God been doing here? Like, what kind of cool things do you have to tell us about what God has been doing here? But they never asked those questions. It was just about imposing their version of the kingdom on us. And so if the institutional church fails, that's okay.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be invested in that. They should be invested in their community instead.
Especially if you're folks who are on the margins and you know that giving up, costs you even more to try to play the game, as it were, within the institution. Because it costs you more, it really causes us pause, it should at least, to consider whether or not that effort and whether or not putting your body literally on the line is worth it, or whether you could take that same effort, that same vitality or life or energy and put it into something that grants liberation.
Yeah. When we talk about inclusion, we always need to be inclusion into what? What is it exactly that we're seeking inclusion into, and why?
Yeah.
Why do we want chairs at these tables?
Mm-hmm. And
why don't we just build our own table?
Exactly. And I feel
have our own place.
It's because we have some formation within us that cares to get dad's approval, to get white dad's approval, to get the institutional approval, that matters. I only speak of my own experience, perhaps, but it's like you would put your energy there because I don't know if I have transferable skills elsewhere, but because I care for that approval within my old formation said that matters, right? Yet today we think of, and you said the church as a whole, there are possibilities, there is hope, was the word you used. There's hope. What does it look like? It certainly is not institutional, so it's more organic. Ergo, it's smaller. What are the features of life-giving community? Because so much of the language is the same. The language we grew up in, for our context, evangelicalism, it's really similar. Let's do community well, a life-giving community. Let's love each other well. Let's do good. There's a lot of language that needs to perhaps be reclaimed or discarded. But if we think of investing into the new thing, what are the critical features of those new things? Knowing, A, there's no rubric or formula, and B, we're figuring out this as we go. The quote that you used was, "You make the road by walking." If you were to grab highlights or ideas or even pieces of a dream of what these communities can look like in their function or organization or even beliefs, what would some of those features be?
Well, I think of the hand drum group I belong to. Or I think about the lodge where I've gone for moon ceremonies. Because we all exist in communities that we like. Right? Like we all exist in some way in the communities that we like, even if it's just like George Carlin, joked about, there was the group of people who get together to complain about their job. And it's like, yeah, it's called the bar. So, but we all get together in communities that we like. We all have friends that we share meals with. And that's where it starts. We have, we belong to a soccer club. That's our community. Like I overthink things so much.
Yeah. But is soccer club chasing justice and liberation?
It might. It could.
It could, but does it? Like
it might. It could. Like I don't know. Like my drum group could chase justice. Like there's some things a couple of things that we have done to deliberately chase justice. We ribbon skirts. There's a lot of people there's women who don't feel comfortable in ribbon skirts for a lot of reasons, but there's also two-spirited people who don't wear who don't wear ribbon skirts. So we decided early on that skirts would be admired, not required. So if we were going to do a moon ceremony or perform somewhere, if the elder required us to wear skirts, then we would ask another elder to conduct the ceremony for us, because I'm not going to tell an elder how to shape their ceremony. Right? Like their ceremony, their rules. But if we're inviting somebody to do a ceremony for us, then we're going to invite somebody who isn't going to require skirts. So that was one early thing that we did to make sure that people in our group felt welcome. And then for years, we were called the Strong Water Women. And we recently changed our name to the Strong Water Singers because we had a non-binary member. And it occurred to me that Strong Water Women did not reflect that non-binary member. And so I asked, so it's okay, we need to change this to the Strong Water Singers. Like that kind of work for justice, it can start that simply in whatever community you're in. So you start looking, and that's, kind of also a task in the book. Look at where you're organized, where you're already organized, whether it's your union or your workplace or just your friends that you get together with regularly. What can you change? What needs to change? What are you perpetuating? And what can you do differently? Anybody can organize a reading circle. I mean, that's really what churches are, is they're a book club. It's a book club that meets every Sunday to learn from one book. So it's basically a big book club. So you can organize a small book club that puts the Bible in conversation with other books, puts the Bible in conversation with Miriam Kaba's work on abolition, puts the Bible in conversation, with your book or my book. And, how can we understand these stories differently? Like the Good Samaritan is a real bee, and I've got a real bee in my bonnet about that one, because the Bible Jesus doesn't call him good. He's just the Samaritan. We call him the Good Samaritan to separate him from all of those bad Samaritans. We make him the good one. We make him the good one. But Jesus doesn't call him the Good Samaritan. He's just a Samaritan. And the robbers who harm, they're not identified as Jewish or Samaritan. So, you could make an argument that they were Roman because they're not identified as Jewish or Samaritan. And then we make up these stories about how the priest and the Levite were afraid of becoming unclean. Well, that wasn't an issue because they were heading away from Jerusalem. They were done. And you existed in states of ritual uncleanness all the time. That's just normal life. It's not like you had to live in a state of ritual purity like all the time. That was only important if they were on their way to temple. But it was no longer important on the way out of temple. So we impose that on the story. It's not there. Jesus, and then when you take that story and you put it up against a story from, I think it's Second Chronicles, where the Jews are coming back from exile, it was the Samaritans who helped them. And Jesus' listeners would have known that. That would have been like their thing, right? Because they're listening to Torah every Saturday, at synagogue or temple. So Jesus was asking them to return to themselves, to remember old alliances in the face of Roman opposition, in the face of, because they're both experiencing Roman oppression. And so that's something that we can do inside the church. Is we can look at these stories and say, is there another way? Is there a way that this story can move us towards justice rather than self-righteousness? Because so many of the ways we read these stories move us towards self-righteousness.
Yeah.
And for me, that doing that has meant listening to Jewish writers, listening to Jewish thinkers. Like Rabbi Daniel Rutenberg has been a huge influence on me. I'm just gonna Amy Jill Levine. I've read some of her work. Rabbi Mike on Twitter is on fire. So I've been listening to a lot of Jewish, because they're giving me a much different way to read those stories.
Of our own, what we would call our own stories, in fact, through the lens of their story.
We're making so much noise right now about how Jesus was Jewish and the early church was Jewish and blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, then let's listen to what do Jewish people think about these stories.
Yes.
If we're making so much noise about that, then let's listen to them. And let's hear these stories differently, because that's, to kind of get back, to kind of my parable of the Anishinaabe and the deer. That's what the Anishinaabe did that winter. They listened to their stories, because what else are you going to do? Like we're all, in the winter now, we're all hunkering down, watching Netflix and Disney and whatever. So that's what we do in the winter. We listen to stories. And then events in our lives change how we hear that story. Like, I don't know, I watch the X-Files all the time. I'm obsessed with it. But since I've gotten really oriented around abolition, it's propaganda. I see it now as propaganda. And I'm kind of horrified by some of that. And we've seen what QAnon has done, to our political system. And I see now how X-Files really contributed to that, to the idea of conspiracy theories and shadow governments and all of that stuff. So every time we enter these familiar stories, we come to them differently and we see something different in them, but we don't always, particularly with the Bible, we don't give ourselves permission to read them differently. We somehow invest whatever tradition we're part of as some kind of ultimate truth. Like my mom will often say that something is biblical, that this way of it's biblical. It's like, polygamy is biblical too, Mom. Like everybody thinks that their way of reading the text is biblical. Like that's, to invest that kind of authority in whatever preacher you follow is really kind of ridiculous. So Christians need to give themselves permission to read these stories differently, to bring themselves to them differently, and to not be so invested in the institution. The institution, and really the Protestant church has a long history of fragmenting off and trying something different. There's a long tradition of that in the Protestant church. So keep doing that.
Keep doing that.
Keep doing that. Keep trying. Take another run at it. I don't know, man. The Zapatistas have a beautiful way of thinking about many worlds. That there are many worlds. There's 1,000 worlds waiting to be born. So really, we need to shed this idea that there is a single world that we all must conform to and we all must live within. There are many worlds, and we live in a world of many worlds. And we can coexist. I mean, if the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee can make treaty and coexist in this place, anybody can get along, because we are two very different peoples. Like even like our political systems, our cosmologies, we are very different people. So if we can find a way to live together in peace and goodwill and all of that, I think really anybody can.
This concludes a 2-part series with Patty Krawec. Thanks for listening in. I hope that you pulled out some interesting and insightful ideas about ways forward into liberation, would you do me a favor? And if you enjoyed these episodes, please share them. Also, review our podcast, leave a rating wherever you listen to them. We'll see you on the next episode.